Hello everyone, this is Cabane the Christian. Today, I want to talk to you about Russell's Teapot. Before we get into the substance of the video, I want to just make a disclaimer so that people who are thinking about writing comments don't waste their time on something which might get deleted. I will accept comments, including comments that are critical of the argument if they are respectful, if they don't dive into irrelevant issues, if they do not recite cliches like, and I'm not actually saying this to be polemical or insulting or whatever. I mean, I know when I first started making videos on this channel, I was a real jerk, and of course, there's always going to be some jerkiness in me, but by God's grace, I hope that it's been reduced somewhat over the years, and I do apologize to those whom I was jerkish to. One invents all kinds of reasons for why it's okay to be a jerk, but the simple truth is it wasn't, and I'm sorry. But I don't say this to be a jerk, which is that things like, oh, I'm so sorry for you, your parents must have brainwashed you, despite the fact that my parents aren't the same religion, my dad's not a Christian. Oh, you believe in an invisible skydaddy, you need to move into the modern world, when in reality I deeply considered naturalism and really tried to work through each of the challenges it's made. Belief in God is like belief in fairies and stuff like that. I want you to understand, if you make these comments, and I say this very seriously because there have actually been some people with whom I've spoken who have talked this way and who eventually have come to rethink their position. And I hope that I played some small part in that. I want you to understand, if you're thinking of making this kind of comment, or if you often make this kind of comment, just set aside for a moment what you think must be going on inside my head. Now, every person on this planet has certain instinctive intellectual defense mechanisms when dealing with other people who hold fundamentally different views than they do. This is not a uniquely atheist thing. Christians do it. Muslims do it. Everyone in the world has these kind of defense mechanisms. And one of the principal defense mechanisms is to impute insincerity, self-delusion, or intense cognitive stress to anyone who disagrees fundamentally with your framework for understanding the world. So very often, let's just take what a Christian might do. So there's this guy, I'm sure you've seen him, Satan Bruggencate. He calls himself a presuppositionalist. The reality is that his form of argumentation is not a classical presuppositional apologetic in the Van Tillian sense, which is a rational argument for the necessity of belief in God, for the intelligibility of the world. His is much more the Clarkean presuppositionalism of fideism, which is not sound, and in my humble but accurate estimation, he's a jerk. Let's just take what he says. So, Sai believes that the Bible requires him to think that the unbeliever knows, as far as I am interpreting him, and I think I'm interpreting him correctly, someone can correct me if I'm wrong. He thinks that the Bible, in particular Romans 1, teaches that the unbeliever knows for a fact, at a conscious level, that God exists. And that the suppression of his knowledge of God basically is constituted by lying about what he really believes. So anyone who disagrees with Mr. Bruggencate, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, anyone who disagrees with him is simply cognitively incorporated into his view of the world by saying, well, they don't actually disagree with me. They actually know that I'm correct, but they are lying about it or self-deluding at a very kind of surface and superficial level. Now, I know that he's wrong about that because there was a time in my life where I was genuinely, deeply unsure about the existence of God. I mean, I probably, even though I would never have stated this, I probably would have leaned towards the idea that God did not exist. And it was a very stressful time, but I'm not a person who deals very well with cognitive dissonance. I can't really hold contradictory things together without an enormous amount of stress, and that stress has to be resolved. I mean, eventually things have to be integrated properly. But I know that he's wrong because I know for a fact that I myself once very sincerely believed that it was more probable than not that God did not exist. Now, remember, I wouldn't have put it in those words, but looking back, I mean, that's really the way that I was leaning. Eventually, of course, I became genuinely convinced that God exists and that Christianity is true. So that's how Psi deals with opposing viewpoints. And it's a very easy and convenient way of looking at the world because it prevents you from having to ask, well, why are there people who think fundamentally differently about such basic and important issues? More, why are there smart people who think fundamentally differently about these basic issues? That in particular is tough. It can create a lot of stress in some people. And so the easiest way is to say that they don't. Either they're dumb, they don't know what they're talking about, or they're self-deluded. So, to my dear atheist friends who tend to participate in new atheist culture, I know there are different kinds of atheists out there, but I have encountered many who kind of participate in the it's so ridiculous you believe in a skydaddy, we've moved on in the world, stuff like that. So hear me, please. If you just set aside what I consider to be your defense mechanism, then I think we can have a much more reasonable discussion. And here's what I think your defense mechanism is. And I know you wouldn't call it a defense mechanism. I know that you're not intentionally utilizing a defense mechanism. I know you guys really believe that I'm absolutely self-deluded. You think I'm a madman. You think that I've brainwashed myself, or my parents have brainwashed me, or I'm just so committed. I just want to believe so badly that I've desperately avoided reading the arguments of those who disagree, and so on and so forth. I know that that is what many of you genuinely believe, and I'm not saying you're lying or being deceptive or anything like that. But I want you to consider for a moment that I might actually be telling the truth about my own thought process, which is that, number one, I have very seriously considered naturalist argumentation over a long period of time, from many different angles, because I'm the kind of person, and I know there are people that, I'm sure some of you are like this. I'm the kind of person who, if there's a book that promotes a thesis that I agree with, I have to always read the negative reviews first. It doesn't matter if I would really like to not read them, but I have to read them. This is, when I was first getting interested in apologetics, this is, it's what made it such a long process, which is that I read The Case for Christ, and I had to Google Case for Christ refuted. There was just no way to avoid the reality that I knew some people had read the book and continued to disagree, so I had to read their arguments. And I didn't know how to respond to their arguments for a very long time. And the same goes for many, many different aspects of my framework for interpreting the world. So over a long period of time, which you can hear about in my video series on my quote-unquote journey of faith, to speak in a hipsterish manner, over my journey of faith, which I really kind of count from around 2006, 2007 to 2014, because 2014, and you'll hear more about this in those videos, I don't want to say it here because I don't want to start a tangent. 2014 is when I really kind of, as I look back on my life, 2014, which is a reasonable amount of time ago now, at least as far as my life is concerned, almost 5 years. In 2014, I integrated a lot of things which I did not think were integratable, or were not easily integratable. And once those things were integrated, in a way that I found intelligible, in a way that I found defensible, in a way I found convincing, by God's grace, I stopped doubting. And I stopped doubting as someone who really has tried genuinely to understand the views of those who disagree with me at a fundamental level. So this has turned into quite a long thing because I really would like you to understand it. Not so that I can win an argument with you, but because trying to think how to phrase this in a way that doesn't sound absolutely patronizing. Not so that I can just win an argument and have the kind of satisfaction of dominating another atheist, because that, honestly, I find that to be so... It's really... It doesn't get me anywhere. It doesn't get you anywhere. What I want you to understand is that the world is a big world, and this is going to sound patronizing. There's no way to avoid it, but it's really not my intention to sound patronizing. The world is a really big world, and there are lots of people who are very intelligent, who have many different views about it. Now, that is also something which has to be integrated into being confident in one's own worldview. A lot of people have trouble integrating that. I've found a way to integrate it. I'm not going to go into all of that right now, but I go through life. I do not doubt the reality of God. God is as real to me as anything else, and that doesn't prove that I'm right. You can think you're just crazy. You're deluded. It's a delusion. It's a imaginary friend. You can believe that. But this is just kind of, as I go through life, I don't doubt that God is real. I don't doubt that He loves me, that He has a purpose for creation, that His ultimate end is to subdue all things at the feet of Jesus Christ, who is risen from the dead and is Israel's Messiah. And I find that as I go through life, with my head kind of wrapped around the Bible, according to the tradition of the church, things become intelligible. And again and again, the activity and providence and wisdom of God has been very clear to me. And it's one of the things, this is a tangent, one thing that's interesting is we deal with the problem of evil on a very kind of high up level. And kind of the classic intellectual rebuttal of the problem of evil, understood as a logical argument, which is that the existence of God is incompatible with the existence of moral evil. The typical response is, it is possible logically that God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the kind of evil that He permits. And some people say, well, that's kind of callous, and it would be callous were it a response to someone who has just suffered an immense loss. But it's not meant for that. It's meant to respond to a logical argument, which is about incompatibility. And it's predicated on the idea that, number one, there are many things that we don't know circumstantially. And that's both about facts, about the world. Like, we don't know X person's state of mind right now. We don't know what it was yesterday, and we do not know what it will be tomorrow. We don't know everything that that person has done, or said, or thought in his or her life. Moreover, we don't understand, in a comprehensive sense, or even in a nearly comprehensive sense, this chain of cause and effect. When we look at this, I mean, this is why there are historians who study the 1980s. I mean, there's really not that much debate about what actually happened in the 1980s. We have an enormous amount of documentation. By the way, I want to let you know, the disappearance of local newspapers is going to be a huge problem for future historians, because people don't read local news now. They read national news on the internet, and when local newspapers all go out of business, that means that actually in 50 years, historians are not going to be able to document what happened at a local level. I don't think people really understand the lack of information. It's going to cause complete tangent, totally irrelevant. But there's not that much dispute about what actually happened in the 1980s. The dispute is about the interpretation. How does all this stuff kind of hang together? How does one event relate to another event? What exactly is the causal relationship? And that will generate millions and millions and millions of pages of debate, because causality is enormously complicated and we don't understand it in a comprehensive sense, or in a nearly comprehensive sense. We discern general patterns and certain relationships, but not nearly comprehensive enough, because understanding that requires, number one, a comprehensive understanding of facts, and number two, a comprehensive understanding of the relationship of everything to everything else. So, just given kind of the nature of God in the Orthodox Christian understanding, and I just mean the Nicene, Catholic, Protestant, Eastern Orthodox, the Orthodox Christian understanding of who God is and what He's like, He understands comprehensively exactly the cause-effect relationship that everything has with everything else, and all true facts. He understands, and He apprehends directly, and is aware of directly, every truth about the world. And so, is the existence of the evil in the world incompatible with the existence of this kind of God? The argument is no, because it is because His knowledge is so much greater than ours that there are many possibilities within that gap for morally sufficient reasons. Now, I started talking about that because one of the things that I find really interesting, and I am not saying that this applies to everything, by the way. So if you know someone and you say, I know this person really well, I know their life story really well, I have no idea why this horrible thing happened to them. I'm not saying it's universal, but I am saying it's not unusual at all when you get to know specific people with specific stories. You start to see, wait, I see how this period of suffering in their life was ultimately ordered towards something which blessed them and others. And it's kind of like what people say about genocide. You look at a figure of several million people, right? And it's just a number. You look at the faces of those who have died. You look at children who have lost their mothers and fathers, then it becomes real, it becomes concrete. It's the same thing with understanding, at least in part, providence, suffering, and so on. You hear about all the suffering in the world, and it looks so random, so kind of haphazard. It's just, but when you look at specific people and you hear their specific stories, then you realize that actually there's maybe more good coming out of this than I thought at first. And so I said all that basically to say that God is a kind of daily reality. Intellectually for me, I have prayed many specific prayers, and by God's grace, many of them have been answered in really remarkable ways. I'm directly aware of certain miraculous events. Now, you can believe that I'm totally deluded about this stuff. And that's fine if you want to believe that. However, what I'm saying is that as I live and I walk in this world, it makes a great deal of sense to me within a Christian framework. So, this all started as a disclaimer about my commenting policy and why I block people and why I delete comments. But what it's kind of turned into is that video I was thinking of making addressing atheists who participate in the culture of New Atheism. Just to say, I'm just asking you, just to consider whether, not necessarily whether I'm right, though obviously I'd like that as well, and I would like you all to become Christians, but whether you are wrong about my own reasons for believing. Whether I might actually believe in Christianity having really tried to get at the truth of things, having really tried to grapple with the arguments on all sides. Whether I've concluded that God exists not out of a childish desire to have an imaginary friend, though I do desire that God exists. I much prefer the Christian world to a naturalist world, I'm not going to lie about that. But consider whether the reason that I've come to believe so strongly is because, having thought carefully about the issues, having tried to read all sides of the argument, I've simply come to the conclusion that Christianity is true. So, you can disagree with me, but I ask that you not pursue these cognitive strategies about my reason for disagreement. And as I said, those cognitive strategies are everywhere. You see them in inter-Christian debates as well. I mean, what is it that Catholics, Roman Catholics, often say about Orthodox? You don't become Catholic because you want to use contraception and get divorced. It's a ludicrous statement. I mean, it's sometimes you also hear, you don't become Roman Catholic because you have an authority problem. As if the Pope of Rome was some kind of immediate threat to my autonomy, more than like a local priest. And the whole thing about divorce and contraception, give me a break. I really should make another video about that. Or Protestants, many Protestants have a very hard time grappling with the fact that other Protestants or Catholics or Orthodox might really want to understand what the Bible says and come to a different conclusion. I think there are specific reasons that the good faith of others who disagree with them exegetically on important issues creates problems. I'm not going to talk about that in detail right now. And Orthodox, by the way, do the same thing to others. You hear kind of shallow explanations of why someone would believe in justification by faith alone. They just want to live a licentious lifestyle, which is a ridiculous statement for at least most believers in sola fide, the traditional form of which does not negate the reality of and necessity of good works. But this is true for everyone. Okay, so let's talk about Russell's Teapot. Russell's Teapot essentially is the argument that if there are no positive arguments that are sound for God's existence, whether empirical or philosophical, if there are no positive arguments for God's existence that are sound, God probably does not exist. Now, I think that there are many positive arguments for God's existence that are sound, both empirical and philosophical. I think the argument from contingency is the single most powerful philosophical argument for the existence of God that there is, and I don't think there's any way around it. The argument from contingency, I remember the moment I understood the argument from contingency. I remember the moment that I apprehended, because I'd seen it floating around there. I didn't really pay any attention to it, but I remember I had a job and I can do this because this is my channel, so I can go on whatever tangents I want to go on. But I remember the moment I was actually doing grunt work at Calvin College. I did my freshman year at Calvin College. By the way, that place is liberalizing like crazy. So you got some really evil stuff going on there. You got professors really just delight in destroying young students' faith. Really ridiculous. I mean, give me an effing break. And anyway, tangent of a tangent. I was working in the cafeteria. I had this ridiculous hairnet on, and I had a mop, and it was like, wow. This is like hell. I mean, yeah, talk about a pampered lifestyle. If that's the worst of it. But I had the hairnet on. Would have been a lot better if I didn't have to wear the dang hairnet. But I had the hairnet on. But I was using a mop, and I remember realizing there's no reason that any of this should exist. There's no reason that any of this has to exist. And I apprehended directly just what an odd thing it was to exist. And most people, I think, have had this experience, because I've heard people talk about it independently. There are moments where you're going through and you realize just how strange it is that there's such a thing as existence. Try to define what it is to see, or what it is to hear, or to talk, or to understand. It's very difficult to do so. Now that relates also to consciousness. There was another day I was sitting in my dorm, and the same year, I was actually going through a big crisis of faith at this point in 2013, early 2013. This might have been late 2012. I can't remember the exact dating, but I was sitting in my dorm, and I'd never actually thought about consciousness before. By the way, I was totally unfamiliar with any argument over consciousness. But I realized why, because I was thinking a lot about atheism at this point. I was struggling a lot with my faith. And this was the last crisis of faith I had. I realized, okay, if the naturalistic account is right, I can understand, just assuming that the naturalistic evolution is completely correct, not only common descent, but naturalistic, non-teleological, that is, goal-oriented mechanisms for explaining common descent. Even if that's all correct, I can understand why there's a brain. I can understand why there's a brain and a body and that kind of stuff, and all of these various behaviors. What I can't understand is why there's this subjective experience superimposed on top of it. I realized later philosophers actually had a name for this concept. It's called zombies. A zombie, in a philosophical sense, is a creature, what looks like a human creature. He has a body, he or she talks, have ideas, experiences, memories, and these are all processed through the brain. And the brain is taking in information through the sensory organs, which are then interpreted through these electrical signals, and then it puts out actions which are ultimately ordered towards survival, given the evolutionary heritage of the brain. But all of that input-output mechanism that occurs in the brain, none of that necessitates subjective experience. You want to know why? Because free will isn't a thing. With the vast majority of materialists, free will does not exist. It cannot exist. Because you are in a rigid cause-effect universe, where the state of things at any given moment is explained completely by the state of things at the prior moment. Or else, there is an element of randomness to it, that is, the state of things at any given moment is determined probabilistically by the state of things at a preceding moment, but the probabilities distribute out not because of any choices, not because of any free will, but simply because of sheer chance. There's no will oriented with it, so there's no free choice associated here. So why do we have subjective experience? Why is subjective experience superimposed on top of our input-output system that runs through the brain, which kind of puts out behavior in the body, which leads to reproduction and survival? It's completely extraneous to what is supposed to be the only reason for our existence on a very naturalistic concept. And I realize that and other people have had this experience too. So those are what I think are the most powerful arguments, kind of philosophically speaking, for the reality of God, for the lack of truth in materialism. So I guess we'll get back to Russell's Teapot now. Russell's Teapot says that if such arguments fundamentally turn out to be unsound, if there are no empirical or philosophical arguments which demonstrate probabilistically or necessarily the reality of God, then God probably does not exist. And he uses as an analogy a teapot revolving around the Earth. I think it's around the Earth. It might be around Mars. Pretty sure it's around the Earth. And he says that if a person came along and said, you know what, I think that there's a teapot revolving around the Earth. And he said, well, why do you think so? He said, well, I don't have any reason. I don't have any argument for that. He said, well, I don't think a teapot revolves around the Earth. And then the person counters, well, I can't prove that it does revolve around the Earth, but you can't prove that such a teapot does not exist. And intuitively, you know the burden of proof is actually on him. This is the argument. You know that given a lack of a positive argument, it is improbable that such a teapot revolves around the earth. Consequently, if the believer in God cannot provide a positive argument, philosophically or empirically, for God's reality, the skeptic is warranted in concluding that God probably does not exist, without having to demonstrate that God's existence is false. He doesn't need to provide a positive argument, in other words, for his atheism, because given that there has been no positive argument for theism, just like the teapot, which goes unargued and is probably not existent, so also the burden of proof lies on the believer in God to provide a positive argument for God's existence. Absent that argument, God probably does not exist. And this seems like a very reasonable argument. And Bertrand Russell, it was a very intelligent guy. I mean, I think contemporary atheists, those who participate in New Atheism, need to look at the way that he talked to his theistic interlocutors and understand that this was a respectful conversation which happened. And the tendency to be disrespectful and arrogant towards those with whom we disagree is, of course, not just an atheist thing. It's a human thing. So that's the argument, and it seems very reasonable. And so when I first heard it, which was back in 2006, 2007, it seemed extremely reasonable to me. And so the way that it's kind of worked out in the New Atheist community is, well, I'm an atheist in that I lack a belief in God. It's not that I can prove to you that God doesn't exist, but I lack a belief in God in the sense that I lack a belief in this teapot. William Lane Craig is a very smart guy. I think he's very philosophically astute. Theologically, I'm not a huge fan. I think Christian philosophers have this tendency to waltz into theology, and their first impression is that the theologians are just talking nonsense and are completely logically incoherent, and so they come in with the intention to basically correct theists or classical theists and to issue corrections to traditional Christian doctrine. I think Dr. Craig is unfortunately a participant in this in his Christology. He just kind of says, well, I think that Christ has just one will, and that will is a divine will. I see no reason to think that there are two wills. It just kind of weighs it off without really considering the reasons philosophically and theologically why two wills in Christ are important. And by the way, if you're an atheist who's still listening, you don't need to say that you think this argument is completely... You don't need to say that it's an argument about angels and pins and stuff like that. I know you think that. I really do understand how you think. I intellectually empathize with that. And by that I mean that I can understand what it feels like to be an atheist who thinks theists are stupid. I think it's really important for us all to have intellectual empathy and understand why it is that a person might hold a position different than our own. Really try to understand what it would be like to hold that kind of position and what the world would look like in that position anyway. But he kind of weighs it off, and that's really the end of the matter, because his Christology is basically just a philosophical problem. As far as I can tell, and I've read his treatment in Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, and I've read his discussion on reasonable faith in response to some questions about it. Same thing with the eternal generation of the Son. He kind of weighs it off, says, well, I think that the sonship of Christ is something which is acquired in the incarnation, which is completely just... has a terrible effect on theology as a whole, and he points to monogenes, allegedly meaning unique one, rather than only begotten. So, not only begotten, but one and only. That's a modern kind of etymology of the word. I just invite people who at least know how to pronounce Greek, go to John 1 and read all the Ganao language there. Look at how many times that John mentions sonship in John 1 to 18. And ultimately speaking, I think the etymology, by the way, is totally wrong. I think it does etymologically mean only begotten, but even if it didn't, it carries that term in John's Gospel because it is used next to all this birth language. And John is a speaker of Greek. He knows it sounds pretty much the same, and he's obviously intending to make a literary connection. The Apostle Paul in Ephesians 3 also says that all fatherhood is named after the Father in relation to the Son. That is, the sonship of Christ is not something which imitates the father-son relation in the world. Rather, the father-son relation itself signifies that eternal relationship in God, because this world is not something which is foreign to God, which he needs to condescend in some kind of way that's unnatural for himself. He created it specifically as the theater for the revelation of himself. Another tangent. William Lane Craig is a smart guy. Good philosopher, not a good theologian. But on this issue, I've watched probably around half of his debates with atheists. It used to be many more than that, but he's continued to debate since I last went through the whole set, which is several years ago. And I have a real problem with how he deals with this, because I don't think that he deals with the fundamental intuition, which is driving atheists to say, I don't say that God doesn't exist, I just have a lack of belief in God. I don't think he understands or doesn't acknowledge the distinction which they're making in the fundamental thought process which drives that distinction. And the thought process is the one laid out in the kind of Russell's Teapot thing. God is a thing that we're arguing exists or doesn't exist, and absent any evidence for his existence, there's no reason to think that it's 50-50. We would just say, like anything else, that he probably does not exist. So that's the argument, and I understand the intuition behind it. As time went on, as I began to understand Christian doctrine more, something started to strike me as intuitively mistaken about this argument, but I could never really put my finger on what it was. But something started to strike me as wrong with this argument. That's another point. Intuition is a very powerful tool. We have to recognize the power of the tool, but we also have to understand that intuition is not something which exists kind of as a built-in set of programming that apprehends truth. Intuition is something which emerges out of a way of looking at the world, and our intuition often depends on certain assumptions that we hold, which we might not even explicitly recognize, but it depends on certain assumptions about the world that drive us to regard something as implausible, or certain prior beliefs about things that drive us to make to evaluate a particular claim as implausible. This is one reason I think so many people find naturalism so very plausible when they first encounter it, as I did. And I've continued to find it plausible for many years. And only stopped around 2014. And of course that was to varying degrees. The reason I think people find naturalism so plausible is because they have assimilated certain aspects of a worldview which is naturalistic just by osmosis, without any intention to assimilate anything naturalistic. They have assimilated certain assumptions about things which produced naturalism in the first place. So then when they encounter it, it seems like, and if you're an atheist and you're still watching, thank you so much for watching, but I get it. You encounter atheism and it seems like it all makes sense. It seems like all of these things which used to just make no sense and be arbitrary, all of these things suddenly just fit right into place and the world becomes intelligible. That is what drives people to find atheism so plausible. And it is that, I think, which drives people to then look at theists who encounter atheists and say, what are you doing? How could you continue to believe in God, given this obviousness that atheism seems to have? It's an intuition, and it is a rational intuition given certain prior beliefs. We'll talk about that at more depth another time, what exactly are those prior beliefs. Give you a kind of foretaste. One of those concerns the alleged Newtonian worldview. I say alleged because I don't think it actually has anything in principle to do with Newton's theory, but it was the way his theory was interpreted, which is that the order of things is self-perpetuating. And the story goes that we used to need to appeal to God or gods to explain why clouds moved across the sky and why thunderstorms came at particular times and why the sun moved. But Newton discovered that we don't need God or gods to explain this. It's explained by gravity and then these other laws which produce these other effects. Now, that's a category error, because gravity doesn't explain anything at all, because gravity is not anything which does anything, because it's not a thing. A law is a metaphor. It's a bad metaphor, and the reason it's a bad metaphor is because what laws do is they prescribe things. They say you can do this and you can't do that. But laws of physics are descriptive. They only describe the way that things behave. They don't give any kind of obligations or anything. They're just the way things behave. And so we say, given two bodies of a certain mass, they will move in this relationship to each other, and we can mathematically pinpoint exactly what that relative movement is going to look like. And we can do that at a very large scale, and we can do it very, very precisely. But it's not an explanation of anything. It's a description. It's a beautiful description. It's a precise description. It's a very useful description, but it's not an explanatory one. And this is an error that physicists make too, in saying that, well, Newton, he described gravity, but he couldn't explain why it was there. Einstein explained why it was there, because now we know that space-time is this fabric, and the Earth, or let's just say the Sun, creates depressions on this fabric, and the Earth rolls around these depressions. Well, the problem is that this is an analogy that is based on gravitation itself. Well, why does the Earth create these depressions? Well, the reason that makes sense to us is because if we have a sheet, if we just stretch out like a bed sheet, for example, have four people hold it, and we put a basketball in the middle of it, it's going to create a depression at the center of it. But the only reason that it's going to create that depression is because the gravity of the Earth is drawing the basketball close to the center. That's the only reason. But we cannot use gravity and a relationship which only makes sense in light of the gravitational field of the Earth to, quote-unquote, explain why gravity exerts this relationship. Gravity doesn't exert anything. These, remember, are descriptions, not prescriptions, not explanations. But we're so used to thinking of them in terms of laws. Now, if you don't understand what I just said, don't assume that I was just talking nonsense, because this point has been made by people a lot more intelligent than me. And it fundamentally has to do with the nature of causality and what exactly does it mean for one thing to cause another thing. And it's very important to really grasp this, because if we recognize this, if we recognize that patterns of behavior, consistent patterns of behavior, mathematically intelligible patterns of behavior don't explain anything at all, then suddenly the narrative changes. The narrative shifts. We stop thinking of the world in mechanical terms. We stop thinking of the world as self-perpetuating, which is very important. We realize that, well, why does the Earth and the Sun, why do they move relative to each other in this way? The explanation is that God moves them. God moves them directly. And He moves them in patterns. He moves them in regular patterns. But this is no argument that the movement is not personal. We live in very regular patterns. In a piece of music exists in certain patterns. If you take a sheet of music, you will see that the notes have a particular relationship to each other. That relationship is intelligible mathematically. You can describe it mathematically. But the music doesn't play itself. You have to have personal action, which is realizing the music in a particular way, which creates these audible sounds, which makes the mathematical interrelationships among the notes present to us in a way that they would not otherwise be. So that's one of the intuitions, I think, that drives people to really see atheism as self-explanatory. It's this narrative about the progress of science, that the progress of science began with Newton, and it is to be understood in basically science taking over areas which were formerly explained by divine activity. But when we recognize it's a metaphysical error, that in fact divine activity continues to be as direct as it was in the ancient world. It's simply its patterns, its inner beauty, its intelligibility is understood better. Then kind of the narrative begins to dissolve. I don't use the word narrative in a condescending sense, and this is reflective of my own kind of personal spiritual biography, or whatever. So I don't remember how I got onto that issue from the issue about the teapot. But there you go. So the teapot, it's the idea that the teapot revolves around, or someone makes a claim that the teapot revolves around the earth. They say they have no evidence for it, and they say to you, well, you've got no evidence against it, so you should be agnostic about the teapot. You can't say the teapot probably doesn't exist. And that would be absurd, because without any evidence for the teapot's existence, you'd be perfectly warranted in saying it doesn't exist. But that's an intuition. And people can have correct intuitions, but be mistaken about their actual basis. And I think that this is a case where people are mistaken about the actual basis of the intuition. I think I was telling why my own shift in intuition. Yeah. So as I started to kind of restructure my worldview and reinterpret things which I had interpreted in a particular way all of my life, including as a young kid who was raised in a Christian household. My mother was Christian, or is Christian, and my dad is a deist, but not Christian, but very good dude. So it's not one of these tragic, huge family conflict stories. But of course, if you are a Christian, I would like you to pray for my dad. So yeah, and my mom, of course, and my brother, whatever. We all need prayer. So yeah, I began to intuit that the argument was flawed in a way that I could not yet put into words, but something about it no longer seemed right to me in a way that was not evident to me before. It used to seem like a very powerful argument, and it seems to me that William Lane Craig has really just kind of not addressed the intuition that lays at the heart of the argument, because he deals with atheists who really, I mean, he doesn't do this intentionally, it's just true. Most people who go and take up his challenge to debate, for some reason, think that they can just go into it without preparing, and it's so maddeningly stupid. I mean, that Christopher Hitchens was a really kind of smart guy and very good rhetorician. It's too bad that he's gone. But he was just taken apart. By the way, it's amazing to me that people will comment on that debate and say, wow, Hitchens slaughtered Dr. Craig. I mean, come on, guys. I don't know if you haven't watched it, but if you are so kind of detached from the actual flow of argument that you think he slaughtered Dr. Craig, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. Because, I mean, you can think that Dr. Craig was off his rocker, and he still would have won that debate. Because you could say that, well, Hitchens should have said A, B, C, D, and E, but he said none of them. He lost that debate. Anyway, people go into these things thinking they can just not prepare because theists are stupid or something like that, and they always lose, and they're usually not great on their feet thinkers. So Dr. Craig they'll say, well, I'm not an atheist in the sense that I say God does not exist. I say I lack a belief in God because no one has provided me what I take to be a sufficient argument for his existence. And then Dr. Craig will say, well, that's just agnosticism, because if you can't provide a positive reason for thinking that God does not exist, you should just be an agnostic. You shouldn't be an atheist. Well, I really think that this ignores the fundamental intuition which lies at the heart of people saying that I lack a belief in God, rather than actively disbelief, which is the Teapot thing. So, what's the problem with the Teapot argument? This is eventually what I realized about it. And here's what I want you to understand, my dear atheist friends. So, you've already heard me give my long speech about why you should just kind of set aside the kind of immediate reactions, the immediate desire to comment ridiculous, or call me ridiculous in the comments. So let me just renew that here. Just hear me out and just try to and think about it for some time to see if maybe I'm right here. And of course, if you've got a sound, logical argument against this, you're free to post it in the comments, and I will not delete it. But here's the problem. The idea that undergirds Russell's Teapot is that God is a thing existing in a sea of things. That's the first one. The first kind of underlying premise which undergirds the argument. That God is a thing in the sea of things. And just as we have to provide evidence or reason to think that anything in this sea of things exists in the way that it does, so also we do for God. When in reality, God is not a thing in the sea of things. Theism, classical theism, I'm not talking Mormon theism or kind of process theism, which are just, let's just throw those out. Those are not philosophically defensible. Theism is not the positing of the reality of a particular being whom we call God. Theism is a statement about the way the world is. Theism says that in response to the question, why does anything exist at all? Because God exists necessarily and has chosen to create a world which does not have to exist. That is why anything exists at all. Why does matter exist in the way that it does? What is it which causes matter to exist in the way that it does? Because God has chosen to realize this possibility concretely in the world, and he continues to sustain it in existence. In other words, theism is an explanatory matrix for the existence of things as they exist. What about atheism or naturalism? I prefer naturalism because naturalism gets really at what I'm talking about. Naturalism is no more, or is no less, a positive explanatory matrix for the existence of things than is theism. It is not simply lacking a belief in God. Because in order to be a naturalist, you also provide a specific answer to the way the world is. Naturalism states that things exist of themselves. They simply exist and perpetuate their own existence. This is what logically unfolds from the denial of the existence of a necessarily existent being who created things and sustained them. If there is no being who sustained and created things, then things exist ontologically independently of themselves. And why do things behave in the way that they do? Why is there such a relationship among things that we use the word gravity to describe? Well, that's the way things behave. Very often, it's not recognized that this question even needs to be asked, and that's not something I really fault people for. It's just most people don't think in these terms. People imagine gravity to be something which actually explains something rather than a descriptive scientific theory. Descriptive, not explanatory. The way that we can say it's explanatory is that gravity, what the theory of gravitation does is it unites different phenomena in the same descriptive pattern. So what's remarkable about it is it unveils an inner unity which undergirds the existence of things. So the fact that if I take my shoe and I drop it, it's going to fall to the earth, that the mathematics undergirding that is the same mathematics which is why we see the sun moving across the sky and why we see the moon moving across the sky. It's really remarkable just how the inner unity of the world. But that's the way in which we can speak of gravity as explanatory, in the sense that it integrates multiple previously disparate phenomena into a single descriptive matrix, but ultimately it doesn't explain things in telling us why A causes B. It just tells us the way that A relates to B. And naturalism, a view of the world which says God does not exist, is just as much a positive statement about the existence of material things and what they are as theism is. Theism says material things are contingent and they exist, and their very nature follows out from their participation in the creative will of God. Whereas naturalism says they exist of themselves. And naturalists have various answers to the question of why anything exists at all. Some of them will say that the universe exists necessarily. I'm not going to deal with this argument in detail here, but the problem with that, as I see it, is that if something exists necessarily, its necessary existence is explained in terms of its properties, right? So why is it that, what's an example? Let's just say that, let's just assume for a moment mathematical Platonism. I know there's debate about that, but let's just assume it for a moment. Why is it that we say that numbers exist necessarily? Because of what it means for a thing, quote unquote, to be a number entails that it exists. That is, its properties entail its existence. So a thing cannot exist necessarily and change, because if it's changing, its properties are changing. But if it is necessary that it exists, its properties should be the same perpetually. Because if the universe at any given point exists necessarily, it means that it should always exist in that particular state. Now, some people would then cite the B theory of time, which is that time in terms of a movement from past to future is an illusion. The B theory of time, in my view, is self-evidently false, because even if everything around us is illusory, we at least know that the subjective experience of moving through time is real, because we are presently having a subjective experience. So ultimately, time in the universe could be illusory, but time as regards our own mental states cannot be illusory, because it is directly apprehensible to us. If we say that our own consciousness is an illusion, well, illusion is a state of consciousness, it's just, we might as well just stop talking philosophy, because then everything is meaningless. That's why I think that the necessity of the universe is an issue. But if you say the universe exists just because, and everything is the way it is just because, I mean, we're not dealing with just a generic thing which exists just because. It's a very specific world we live in. Things work in very specific ways and very specific attributes, and it's remarkable. Here we are, and you're listening to me, and you're thinking, what an idiot. Or, wow, this is the greatest guy I've ever heard talk. I want to give him $50 right now, and those are your only two options, and I recommend the second. 50, that's so low. It's a very strange world we live in, and it's a very specific world we live in. And so you're not just saying, well, X exists, whatever, it just exists. It's ridiculous to go beyond that. You're saying, well, not only does just this generic universe exist just because, but the universe in which there's this thing called stars, and stars move in this specific mathematically intelligible relationship to gravity, and there's this thing called smartphones, and there's a country called Venezuela, and there's a state called Missouri. That's the world that you're saying exists just because. And if things exist just because, then all of that is just because. And at that point, my real question is, why hold that view of the world? Because, as far as I can tell, the attraction of atheism is its explanatory unity. It's the idea, it's the feeling that things used to kind of not fit together very well, and now you see the world through this new lens, and suddenly things begin to make sense. That's the argument that is made by the evolutionary psychologist at Harvard, E.O. Wilson, in his book Consilience. He argues that there's a convergence of various fields of study towards a naturalistic interpretation of the universe. I think he's totally wrong, but I think he's right on the mark on apprehending the reason why many people find atheism extremely persuasive, and why so many people cannot understand why anyone would be a theist. So we're ultimately then dealing with two views of the world, right? We're not dealing with one person saying, well, I think this thing, God, this person exists, and another person saying, well, you need to show me evidence that this thing exists. I have evidence that my computer exists. I can see it right in front of me. And there's evidence that Rome exists. You can go dig and you'll find inscriptions in Latin and books which have been transmitted to us by manuscript tradition. There are things you can point to in regard to that, but you can't show me an argument that God exists. But the point is that ultimately, even if, by the way, everything I just said is invalid, even if my argument for God's existence, what I guess I just presented to you, is invalid, or is unsound, you're still dealing with two views of the world, both of which have positive content. And so, just absent any argumentation, you actually do have to be an agnostic rather than an atheist, rather than saying God probably does not exist, because theism is simply an explanatory matrix, an explanatory framework for existence. And it has positive content. It tells you what a rock is. What is the nature of a rock? Naturalism also tells you what the nature of a rock is. Okay, so that's point one, which is the most important point. Naturalism, theism, both of them have positive content, and if you don't hold one, then you're rolling with the other. Or you can say pantheism or panentheism or something like that, but you know what I'm talking about. Both of them have positive content, and for that reason, absent an argument, you can't prefer one to the other with warrant. Second point is, I don't actually think that people believe a teapot is improbable just because they lack evidence for it. That's what you have, the intuition, absent any evidence for a teapot, that it's improbable, but I don't think that's actually where the intuition comes from. I think the intuition comes from the fact that when we look at the way things arrange themselves, just given, and I use that phraseology lightly, but you look at the way that, given the fundamental kind of patterns of physics, the fundamental kind of ordering and relationships which things have with each other, and you look at a teapot or a teacup, I can't remember if it's a teapot or teacup, just given sheer randomness, given no design out there, it is very unlikely that out of all the possible organizations of matter that could exist without any kind of intervention by a personal being, very improbable that by sheer chance something would arrange itself into a teapot. Because if someone says there's a teapot revolving around the earth, you have to ask, well, how did it get there? Well, the person says in the argument, in the thought experiment, it's always been revolving around the earth. As long as the earth has existed, it's revolved around the earth. Well, that means that it has been revolving around the earth longer than we've been able to go into space. Longer than we have even existed as a species. And so, it presumes that out of all the the enormous possible varieties of shapes that matter in space organizes itself into, out of all of the possibilities, it organizes itself into this one, a teacup. And a teacup is something that we make, that people make. It has intentionality and structure reflected for the specific purpose for which we make it. And yet, by sheer chance, the very same thing out in space has kind of organized itself out of all the possibilities. And so that is why I think we intuit that the teacup does not exist. It's not simply because of a lack of evidence. It's because of the specificity of the organization of matter in space in relation to the possible organizations of matter in space. That is, there are trillions of possible ways that matter could organize itself in space, given the laws of physics, or patterns of physics. And out of those trillions, it has ordered itself into a teacup. A teacup which corresponds to something that we have already invented. And so it's concluded it's very improbable. But now that we understand, in my view, I think this is the reason people intuit it, now that we understand that our intuition towards the improbability, given no evidence of the teapot, comes from its specificity in relation to a wide possibility of material orders. Now that we understand that, I think we can understand why it doesn't apply to the existence of God, because God's existence isn't like that at all. As I mentioned, God's existence is not about the existence of a particular person or a particular thing. God's existence is a component part of a theistic view of everything. Everything exists because it participates in God. A theist holding theism, believing that God exists, is believing something different about the nature of the matter which composes my computer. To say that God exists is to say something different about cars which are presently driving outside. It's to say something different about consciousness. It's to say something specific and different about the sun. And likewise, naturalism is the same way. Naturalism is to make a positive claim about the nature of things. And likewise, to say that God exists is not to speak of one possible contingent ordering of components of existence. That's really important because, remember, the improbability of the teapot, according to this intuition, depends on the specificity and the improbability of its random ordering in this particular set. Now, by the way, this misunderstanding of theism is the basis of Dawkins' argument in God delusion, which is that God is the most improbable being to exist because of his sheer complexity. Well, that assumes that God is a specific ordering of components where one ordering is just as good as any other ordering. But in the traditional theistic view, God is simple, not in the sense that he's dumb, or not even in the Thomistic sense. There are different interpretations of divine simplicity, but all classical theists agree that God is simple in the sense that he's indivisible. That each one of his properties necessarily implies every other one of his properties. You can't divide it up. There are reasons for that. But what this means is that God's being, who and what he is not random, and it's not contingent. And that's why God's existence is fundamentally not analogous to the existence of the teapot. So I have to go to class, but I really hope that you have gotten something out of this, theist or atheist. I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but if you are a person who is interested in faith, who perhaps is considering Christianity, is maybe doubting whatever your faith is right now, or is considering orthodoxy as a Protestant or Catholic Christian, do message me at my Facebook, www.facebook.com/Cabane52, and talk to me about it, because, and also if you're working through a crisis of faith, I really empathize a great deal, and I'll go to some lengths to try to help you work through it. But message me there if you're interested in faith. Maybe you're thinking, if you're wondering whether Christianity might be true, whether Orthodoxy might be true, send me a message, or if you're having crisis of faith, and we can talk about it there. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've been stimulated, whatever your view. Remember the rule on comments, but I do appreciate critical comments, which are well constructed and respectful. So thanks so much.